Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and today we're going to be getting into a subject that many would consider political, and it certainly is a political topic, but it's also just about human beings and human rights and freedom, and we're going to get into that today, as well as, a lot of stuff going on in the world. We are here with Zolal Habibi, and we're going to be talking about Iran today in particular. She is a member of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and so we're going to be getting into that today, but we're going to start with a proper brief overview of Iranian history and current existing, because a lot of the mainstream media narratives have painted certain pictures depending on what country you're listening into or from, and kind of what is going on. So we're going to get into the perspectives of people who are Iranian American, Iranian, and then as well as American. So we've got a lot to discuss today. And Ms. Alal, I would love for you to introduce a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'd like to greet everyone who's tuning into the podcast today. It's a pleasure to be able to join. As you said, I am a activist with the Iranian Resistance and a member of the National Council of Resistance of Iran's Foreign Affairs Committee. I have, dedicated, I guess, the last 26 years of my life to the cause of freedom in Iran. And this is an issue that's very close to my heart because, unfortunately, we are the generation that was born after the 1979 revolution. So we've seen nothing but this regime. But the reality of the quest for freedom in Iran and this fight for freedom in Iran has been continuing for 120 years. And both against the current dictatorship and the previous dictatorship, the people of Iran have never given in and have never given up. And that's what's important. And we feel that these days it's a turning point in the history of Iran, and hopefully we will finally be able to see that true freedom and that true democracy that the people of Iran deserve, and we'll be able to create a secular democratic republic in Iran where everyone will be you know respected and people would be given those God-given rights that they have, but they've been denied systematically for a century, practically.
Right. And this is a dictatorship that slaughters the Iranian people, sometimes by thousands in just a week. In the past, when we've seen protests and oftentimes peaceful protests, nonetheless, they have slaughtered thousands of innocent Iranian people. So can you tell us a little bit about that history?
Yes, unfortunately, the Iranian regime has only been able to keep its grip on power these 47 years now through suppression and execution and torture. Unfortunately, 120,000 people have just been executed for supporting the Iranian resistance movement in Iran. But even if you look in 2025, 2,200 people were executed in Iran. And Iran is the number one country in execution per capita, unfortunately. So it is a leading country in violation of human rights. On the other hand, on December 28th, 2025, uprisings broke out in Iran. Was the spark of these uprisings was a strike by the bazaar, which the bazaar is, the merchants in Iran, and they are like the backbone of Iran's economy. So it's kind of like the Wall Street of Iran. And it was, initially it was because of the fall of Iran's currency and, the economic crisis that we are facing right now in Iran. But within the first few hours, it was clear that the target and the ideal or the goal of these strikes and protests that broke out was the overthrow of this regime in its entirety. And we saw, like, one day later, the students in different universities joined the merchants. So we saw, the different generations coming together in this fight, and then it soon spread throughout society and to all 31 provinces of Iran. And unfortunately, after about the first 10 days, the Iranian regime realized that it can't continue to keep its balance this way. And so they cut off all forms of communication, and they actually, um, created a bloodbath and a massacre, and thousands of people were killed in the protest. We do not have the exact numbers, but we are working on verifying them. Just because there was a 19-day communication blackout, it's very difficult to be able to verify the numbers, but what's clear is that it is in the thousands and thousands, and we have been able to verify the name and, you know, information of about over 2,500 of those who have been killed, with a specific, name, location where they were killed and whatnot. But we're still working on that, and over 50,000 people have been arrested, and their lives are in limbo right now because it's uncertain what the regime intends to do. Right now, just in the past few days, the regime has handed down execution sentences for many of those whose only crime is that they took part in the demonstrations that broke out. As we are speaking right now, it is 40 days after the start of the uprisings. Practically, in Persian culture, we have a thing that usually when someone passes away, they hold ceremonies for them on the third day of their passing, the 7th and the 40th. So this week, in the past few days, it started the different ceremonies in different, locations throughout Iran. People are commemorating the memory of those who've been killed. And these ceremonies that are being held for the 40th day in different cities for different people who have been killed are also turning into a place where people come to show their defiance, and to it's a form of resistance in itself. So the regime is now cracking down on that. They opened fire on gatherings in cities like Abdanan, and they have arrested many people who for just attending these memorial services. So this fight is continuing. The message that we are receiving from Iran on the ground, especially after the end of this internet blockade, yeah, it's still trickled. It's not full extent, connectivity, but people are trying to give their message out, and their messages, look, first of all, try to, I guess, convey what the crimes that were perpetrated in these past few weeks in Iran, because it was crimes against humanity and war crimes that have been perpetrated by this regime. On the other hand, they want to give a message that, we're still continuing. It hasn't stopped. The forms have to change a bit because there's like martial law in place, but people keep on reiterating that this is not over. We're going to continue because we're not going to allow these lost lives to be lost in vain. And we have to continue till the fall of this regime, until the dawn of freedom in Iran.
To give everyone some historical context, could you go over how the Islamic regime got into power and took over Iran in the first place?
No. Well, to be able to explain that, I might have to go back a bit more. Like, what was the situation even before the
Right.
revolution? The reality is that before this regime, there was the Shah, and his father, Reza Khan. He was brought in by the British in a military coup. He was a member of the military of during the Qajar dynasty, and so he was put in place by the British. And once he didn't serve their purposes anymore, he was taken into exile, and then his son was brought in. And during that time, in the beginning, well, Muhammad Reza Shah or Pahlavi didn't have that much power, but so especially since it was like after 1906, where there was a constitutional revolution in Iran, the constitution had formed, people wanted representation. So the prime minister was chosen, and the people of Iran chose Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister. That is the only democratic government that Iran has ever seen in the last century. But it was unfortunately very short-lived because Dr. Mossadegh actually nationalized Iran's oil, and that was not in the interest of Western powers. And unfortunately, the US, so the CIA and MI6, they carried out a coup d'etat and had Dr. Mossadegh removed and reinstated Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. after that, the Shah knew that he has to rule with the iron grip because otherwise his days will be numbered. So we saw, the growth of the Savak, the notorious secret police of the Shah, who executed thousands of people, and their methods of torture are still, unfortunately, unmatched in many fields. And they served actually as the blueprint for what the regime currently is doing. So it's the continuation of the same crimes. And there was a one-party state. The Shah said after the coup d'etat against Dr. Mossadegh, he banned all organizations, parties, associations, and whatnot, and announced that Iran only has one party, and that's the Rastaqi's party. And anyone who doesn't like it, they could either leave the country or they will be arrested. And that is how the Shah ruled. So in 1976, President Carter came into power. He came into office, and he had the human rights diplomacy. That was his, issue. And so he told the Shah that you need to stop execution and torture, because what they felt was, well, these execution and tortures, they are making the people, resentful of the regime. So if you want to keep a balance, so you need to stop that. But what he didn't understand was it was already too late. People already,
Right.
had seen so many people be killed and the tortures and whatnot. So it had already made its impact. So the minute the Shah stopped executing and torture, people in Iran knew that, hey, if you go to a protest, the risk is being killed in the streets. But if you're arrested, there's no torture, there's no execution. So people were willing to take that risk a lot more. And yes, just in one protest on September 8th, 1977, the Shah killed 1,000 people just in Tehran to keep himself afloat. But so it was brutal. The protests were like what we're seeing now. They used force to suppress the protesters, but it was already too late. And so the people of Iran actually revolted against the Shah to be able to put an end to monarchy and dictatorship in Iran. Unfortunately, those who had actually created the revolution, those true revolutionaries were still in prison when the Shah left. The country escaped Iran, and when Khomeini was brought in. So who is Khomeini? Khomeini was a clergy who had spent 20 years in exile in Najaf in Iraq. And he was 6 months before the fall of the Shah, he was transferred to France. And there, Western powers actually met with him. There was a conference in Guadeloupe where they had decided that, well, the Shah is on the verge of falling apart. And because it was the Cold War era, they needed to make sure that who comes next, like what is that power vacuum going to look like? And in their mentality or in their thoughts was, well, these revolutionary groups, they are progressive. So we don't know exactly where they stand in regards to USSR and whatnot. So it's better for us to bring someone like Khomeini, who's a fundamentalist, but he has a stance against USSR. And that is what happened. And so with the help of, foreign intervention, really, Khomeini was placed in, even though the people had revolted. And Khomeini had the network of the mosques in Iran, because during Muhammad Reza Pahlavi's time, the number of mosques in Iran went from 500 to 5,000. Because he actually also used religion to try to legitimize his power. That's why, like, for instance, if you look at their names, it's all something Reza. It's Reza Shah, Muhammad Reza, Ali Reza. They all have Reza because Reza is the 8th Imam, shared Imam, who was Iranian, who is buried in Mashhad. So they wanted to gain legitimacy, like we are the,
Right.
the descent of, prophet and whatnot. And so he used the clergy to try to legitimize his power, because he said, at the time, he would say that I am the shadow of God on earth. So that's why this network of the clergy and the mosque had grown, while all the actual revolutionaries were, or any group who tried to resist they were dealt with, they were executed, they were tortured, they were imprisoned, and they were dismantled in the sense of it. They had to be underground. So that network stepped in and filled that power vacuum. And unfortunately, for the last 47 years, the people of Iran have been suffering under this regime. Khomeini, when he was coming to Iran, he said, I don't want to have anything to do with power. I'm just a father figure. And once I arrive in Iran and things get, on their feet, I'm just going to go to Qom and continue my, studies. But that is not what happened. And his reign of terror began very early on. And he did everything in his power to be able to, keep himself afloat and this regime afloat. And that was through suppression internally, execution, tortures, and export of terrorism and fundamentalism or warmongering in the region. That's why Iran is yet now the number one state sponsor of terrorism. We see its proxies in the region and their effect, and also Iran's destabilizing role in the region and in the world at large.
Right. And I want to get into some personal background as well with you being, Iranian American. Where were you born and raised, and how has it shaped, your perspective on all of this?
I was born and raised in the DC area, so in Northern Virginia. My parents came to the US before the revolution, so I've actually never been to Iran, even though I think there hasn't been a day in my life that I haven't thought about the plight of the people in Iran. So yeah, I grew up in a family that was active against the regime. My father was a prominent writer and a human rights activist, so I got introduced to human rights violations in Iran as a child. I still remember vividly meeting people who were victims of torture when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And they were like my heroes and my role model. Oh my God, these people have, survived this and they're
Right.
continuing to fight. But I always thought that that's in Iran and we're here, so we're safe. But very early on, I learned that the regime sees no borders when it comes to its crimes. And, I knew already that the regime you know, executed children as young as 13 years old, elderly mothers, pregnant women, you know, the captain of Iran's national football team. I mean, the regime wanted to give that message to people that I see no borders and I have no mercy toward anyone. But in summer of 1988, I felt that firsthand because my father was killed by the regime. And that summer, over 30,000 people were executed in the prisons of Iran, 30,000 political prisoners. And they were just asked a few questions. So it wasn't a trial. A lot of them had sentences. Some of them even had finished their sentence and they were waiting to be released. But despite that, they were just asked, a few questions of, do you still stand by your beliefs in supporting the Iranian resistance and the MHA? And if they said yes, they were taken to the gallows straight. And unfortunately, 30,000 people were executed. With that, Khomeini was able to spread fear in society for a generation, really, because every family had either lost someone or they knew someone who had been killed or whatnot. So that was the situation. And coming face to face with this reality as a 7-year-old, it really changed my perspective on a lot of things in life. And over the years, as I learned more, logically, things changed. I started understanding more like what had happened and what was the history and what had happened, what was happening in Iran. So I became active as a teenager, like trying to raise awareness, trying to draw attention to this issue. I remember when I was 12, walking down the halls of, the Congress to try to, garner support for Iran and things like of that nature. But still, I was living my life in the US. Always, I always understood that, there are a lot of things that we take for granted living in a democratic, society. But I always knew that I need to value it and I need to safeguard it because a lot of people are denied these same basic rights. And so it just, changes your perspective on or outlook on what needs to be done or what is important in life. But as a Iranian American, I mean, I think anyone who knows people from the Iranian society, community, both in the US or anywhere else, or Persian culture, they know that education is like really important. And so, I mean, from childhood, I was always told, you need to study and become something. So you could one day go and serve your own people. And that, Iranians, they only accept like you have to either become like a doctor, lawyer, or an engineer. That's like
Right.
how that society is. And so that I was also on that way, in that path. I, after graduating from high school, I was on the path of going to college and then pursuing medicine. But that summer, student uprisings broke out in Iran. And it was the first time since the 1980s that we were seeing protests at such large scale throughout Iran. And it was the new generation coming into the scene. So our generation. And I felt like that brings on like a responsibility. And it was the first time I was being actually, broadcasted because it was the beginning of satellite television or cable television, actually, cable television, CNN and whatnot. So cable news. And we were seeing these footages coming out of Iran. And that was the first time. And so that really shook me. And I was like, what are you doing? Are you going to sit here and be a bystander? Or are you going to do something so you could free Iran and so people can actually return to Iran and be able to serve their people? Because Iran right now is the #1 country in brain drain in the world. So just imagine if all these people were able to actually go and serve their own people and their own country, Iran could be a, prosperous country. But so that was the crossroads that I came to at the age of 18, and I decided to join the resistance. And since then, I have been a member of the Iranian Resistance. Yeah.
So going back to your father's writing, what was he writing about, like kind of calling for? And if I'm understanding correctly, did they come find him here in the US or he had gone back to Iran?
My father, like a lot of them, he wrote a few books which were like about the history of revolution in Iran or, what is happening, trying to, I guess, make sense of the whole process for people, especially because the people of Iran revolted with so much hopes, that they'll be able to say like a free Iran, a democratic Iran, and then that was stolen away from them, that their revolution was hijacked. And so coming to terms with that, understanding like the history of revolutions in Iran and understanding like the effects of, what each revolution lacked or what is needed to make sure that this time we can be successful. So most of his writings and things were about that, but also about the human rights situation in Iran. Like for instance, just articles and whatever and publications to try to draw awareness and raise awareness in regards to the situation in Iran. As I said, like for instance, I remember these people were victims of torture who were staying with us. They stayed with us for like 2-3 weeks so they could go to the UN and testify and also at the US Congress and whatnot. So my dad was doing a lot of that work, that type of work. In 1988, he was working on a project in the border area of Iran and Iraq, and that's when
Mm.
he was killed. I was at the time in the US with my aunt, and so I actually found out about it. Like they tried to hide it from me for about a month, but then I actually found out about it from a newspaper actually because I saw like a newspaper with like 3 pictures of my dad and a poem, and I was like, what is that? And so started reading it, and it said, dedicated to Zolal Habibi, as they say farewell to a father who's like in Farsi would be trampled, but like was gone or passed away. And so I was
Right.
like, "Huh, since when do they write, you know, poems about my dad when he goes here and there?" Because my father was always traveling because of the nature of his work and documentation and whatnot, giving speeches or whatever. So yeah, that's how I came across it. But yeah, and then my mom at that point, she after my father was killed, she decided to join the Iranian Resistance. And so she was 25 with 2, you know, children. but she decided to take that path, and she has been a member of the resistance since then, since 1988. But when you know, at that time, the base of the Iranian resistance was in Iraq. It was a city called Ashraf. And, you know, so we moved from DC to Iraq. It was completely a different world. But then when the first Gulf War happened, it wasn't very safe for kids. So my mom sent me and my brother back to the US, and we were raised by my aunts. But she decided to remain and continue the fight. And I've always taken great pride in having my parents as my parents, because I think they were the best role models for me, because they taught me what's important in life, not through just words, but through their own actions. And I know that it was very difficult for them to make these choices, but they decided to put their people before everything else. And I think that's very valuable.
And now you are following in their footsteps, taking action, serving all this time as an activist. What does that look like? What are you doing and trying to do, and how can people help?
Well, I think first and foremost, what's important to me is to actually be able to echo the voice of the Iranian people and to let the world know that there is a solution to Iran, especially right now in these critical times. And this is where anyone who wants to help can really be an aid and help the people of Iran by echoing their voice. I mean, the message right now, you see, since yesterday, actually negotiations have started between the US and Iran. So you hear a lot of analysis on it. So what is presented is there are two solutions, or there are two choices on the table. One is, negotiations and whatnot, which is policy of appeasement toward the regime. The other is war, but and foreign intervention and whatnot. But the reality is that neither are the solution. Neither war nor appeasement are the solution to the issue of Iran. And this is something that Mrs. Rajabi, she's the president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, she has highlighted this issue not just today, but for over 20 years now. She said there's a third option on Iran, and that's supporting the Iranian people and their resistance. Because appeasement is actually never leads to democratic change. And we have that, the historical facts. I mean, during World War II, appeasement is what led to a full-fledged war. If they had prevented Hitler beforehand, this wouldn't have happened. But on the other hand, war is also never going to bring democracy, and especially not for Iran. If you look at Iran, I mean, even if you look at it completely from a military perspective, Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq, 4 times the population. The terrain is, we have everything. We have mountains, we have desert, we have, forest, we have sea, whatever. It's not a viable solution or alternative. And it's also never going to lead to a democracy. On the other hand, the people of Iran have organized resistance, and that's what sets them apart from a lot of the other countries that we have seen in recent years that have gone through such turmoil or revolutions or whatnot. So we have an organized resistance that has withstood the test of time. Everyone knows what it stands for and what are their principles, what are their values. And I think that's really important because, like, for instance, when they speak about having gender equality, well, you see they have, women in leadership. The president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran for the interim government after the fall of the regime is a woman. 52% of the parliament in exile are women. The entire leadership council of the NEK, which is the main organization, which is a member of the NCRI, are all women. So they're fighting the misogynist regime with its antithesis. Or like when they say they believe in abolition of the death penalty, you see it in their views and, their actions. Or like they are the ones who call for non-nuclear Iran. They're the ones who actually were the first to reveal Iran's nuclear program to the world. So, I mean, every point that they have raised You can see facts that support that. And I think that's really important, especially with a country where people's, you know, trust has been betrayed and their previous revolution was hijacked. On the other hand, a lot of people ask, what is the solution on Iran? So what happens next? Again, only two options seem to be served. It's either the current regime or going backwards in history and going back to the monarchy, which was a dictatorship too. And that's not the solution that the people of Iran are looking for. There's a third solution too, and that's supporting the Iranian people who are calling for a secular democratic republic in Iran. So there is people's sovereignty for once.
Right.
We don't have to choose between different types of dictatorships. We have that potential and that capability to create that democratic alternative, which actually exists, and to be able to put that in place and have free elections. And I mean, I think the people of Iran, as I said, it's a very bright and educated society. They have the capability to build a true democracy. And I think that is what we see, like the Gen Z of Iran. I mean, we're in the, era of communication and social media and whatnot. So they're seeing the world and they know that what they're living right now is not the norm. And they want to move forward in the 21st century. And that is their message. And you could hear it even in the slogans that they have in their chants. Like their chants are like, down with the dictator, down with Khamenei, down with the oppressor, be it the Shah or the mullahs, or no to the crown, no to the turban, freedom and democracy, or freedom and equality, or things of that nature. So they are trying to send their message to the international community that, look, we want to take our destiny into our own hands. We don't want, first of all, someone to be, imposed on us. And we don't want to choose between bad and worse. We have, the choice to move forward. And I think that's a very key and important message. And because there is an alternative, there is a viable alternative in the NCRI and like the 10-point plan presented by Mrs. Rajavi, I think we have a clear roadmap ahead, especially since over 4,000 lawmakers have supported this plan. Over, 130 former heads of state have supported Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan, 100 Nobel Prize winners. And so there's a very good understanding of it in the international community, and people have looked at it and have touched on it. Many have called it like Jeffersonian. And the reality is that what's important, as I said, it's not just on paper and just in words, it's in practice that we have seen it. And so that is why people in Iran are willing to take that risk to come to the streets, because they can be rest assured that there is a viable alternative and there is a bright future ahead. I think one of the major characteristics that a lot of people have touched on in regards to the recent uprising in Iran was, they said, first of all, people on the ground, they said, we've never seen so much hope in people's eyes, despite being faced with such brutalities. And, you didn't see fear in people's eyes, you saw hope. And because everyone knew that this is a sign of the regime's weakness, that it's becoming so barbaric and, their last resort. So if we overcome this one obstacle, we're good to go. That's the message that they had. But the other thing they said was, we saw organizational structure on the ground. And that was the role that resistance units played in Iran. For over 12, 13 years now, the Iranian resistance has been working on a strategy inside of Iran. And that is the spread of or creation of resistance units. So these are groups of people between some are 2-3 people in one unit, some are like 20 people. But they work underground. They're all local in their own cities and their own, in their own communities, that they understand everything. They know who's who. They know how things work. And so they're able to organize at a local level. But they are able to together, like for instance, throughout the country, work together to push forward like different messaging. So, like for instance, just in 2024, they carried out over 39,000 activities, and they targeted over 3,000 centers of repression. So this time when people came to the streets in the uprisings, they automatically felt like they knew what they were supposed to do. And they found it interesting, but they realized that, look, this is the effect that these resistance units have had because they have been, keeping this flame of resistance alive, and they have been, showing the path. So like everyone automatically, once you see something constantly, it just, sits in your head like, oh, this is what you're supposed to do. Or you're supposed to disarm the suppressive forces to be able to defend yourselves. You need to stick together, not be spread out, because that way you guys can, support one another or whatnot. And so you could see that organizational structure even in the uprisings and the protests, and you could see it even in some of the videos that have come out. And I think that that is a major point, or in these uprisings, and that is what sets it apart from the previous ones, and that is why the regime fears it so much, because they know there's nothing more powerful than a people who has made that decision to make that sacrifice, but to make sure that they can gain that freedom. Because I think that everyone have learned that no one's going to hand us freedom in a silver platter. We need to pay the price for it. We have a saying in Parsi, no one's going to scratch your back except your own finger. And that is our policy. I think that that's why we're not looking for foreign intervention. We have the experience of foreign interventions, and we just don't want that repeated again.
For sure.
But we think that we can be that, we can be that change that's needed for society, and we can bring it about through solidarity and working with one another, and to be able to push forward the overthrow of the regime. What we're asking the international community are very simple points. Actually, Mrs. Rajavi, the president-elect of the Iranian Resistance, highlighted 6 points as what it is that our demands are from the international community. There was actually a huge rally in Berlin on February 7th. Tens of thousands of people, attended, and there she raised these 6 points. So the first is, first of all, recognize the people's right to resist. Recognize the right of the Iranian people to be able to resist in face of the IRGCs and the suppressive forces. And so I think that's something that is granted in the, Declaration of Human Rights, but it's very important to be recognized for the people, everyone. The second is that taking immediate action by the UN Security Council to stop the execution of those who've been detained in the uprising and the political prisoners. And the third is, providing facilities that enable the Iranian people to access communication. What we saw, why was this uprising so brutally, suppressed? Because 19 days of communication blackout. So this is something that the international community can do to help the people of Iran. The fourth would be referring Khamenei and the regime's leaders to the UN Security Council for prosecution. And right now, considering the legal, systems, a lot of national courts, like throughout different countries, based on the principle of universal jurisdiction, would be able to pursue this issue, because what has happened in the last month in Iran, this isn't something that happened years ago. This is just last month in 2026. But, the regime raided hospitals and killed protesters who were wounded on their hospital beds. That's a war crime. Right? The fact that they killed so many people on the streets, that is a crime against humanity. And the regime needs to be held accountable for these crimes. And I think the fifth would be, closing the regime's embassies and expelling its diplomats and agents of the IRGC and the Ministry of Intelligence, wherever they are, to be able to, cut off their hands from, the region, or from everywhere, like here in Europe or in the US and Canada especially, and completely cutting of the financial lifeline of this regime, which is the IRGC. Yes, right now the EU and the US and Canada have blacklisted the IRGC, but it's really important for the UK to follow suit. And also, to not limited to that, right now, many of the families of the highest ranking people in the regime are living comfortable lives in the US, in Canada, and Europe, that needs to be stopped. They need to be held accountable. They need to be their their presence needs to be revoked. They need to be sent back to Iran. And the reality is that, like, how is the regime able to suppress the people of Iran this way? There are companies who are providing that technology to them, right? Like face recognition or, the different, censorship tools or whatever that they're using, they are being provided by, different companies in the Western world. That needs to stop. And so that is the call that we have. And I think everyone who's tuning in right now, I mean, reach out to your lawmakers, raise awareness, take part in like demonstrations, rallies, or whatever that are being held in your region to find out more about it, because there are different groups. It's very important to make sure that you're going to the right one. You reach out in the US, you can reach out to oiac.org, and they can put you in contact with local chapters, because they're present in over 40 states. In other regions of the world, you can reach out to iranfreedom.org, and they will put you in contact with those chapters in your country that you could be active with. And if you would like to learn more, because I think raising awareness is key and it's very important. So if you would like to learn more about what is going on in Iran, what is the alternative, who is the National Council of Resistance of Iran, or who is Mr. Rajavi, you could visit ncr-iran.org or mayamrajaviforchange.com and to learn more. And yeah, if you would like to reach out to me directly or have any questions, I'm practically available on most social media platforms. If you search my name on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram. So yeah, I'd be more than happy to share or respond to any questions that you may have.
And we're going to have those links in description below for everyone to check out. And again, this episode was just a brief 30,000-foot overview. So if you want to learn more about the Iranian history, there's a lot you can find out there. And I definitely recommend, using multiple sources and fact checking, especially nowadays with all the fake content out there and all the different narratives. I think it's super important. I'm currently in college writing a research paper on Iran, and, researching it has been really eye-opening, looking at the traditions of the people compared to what we see, which is what the regime is doing, right? And that's what people kind of see the whole country as. And there's a whole group of people living there that are not a part of that, that do not want to be a part of that lifestyle and want to get back to the traditions and lifestyle they had. So I think it's really important that right now we practice worldview and intercultural exchange and really shaping our knowledge of these different places. And so I encourage everyone listening to check it out. There's a lot of stuff about Iran in the news right now, but I would go deeper than that. And I want to thank you for your time today, because, this is important that we have conversations like this, because every single little conversation can reach someone who has influence or impact. I always say you never know who knows who or who knows what. And so I think it's important. So I want to thank you for your time today. It's an honor to be able to host you and spread that impact and awareness.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and good luck in your studies. And yeah, and we hope that Iran will be free soon, and we can invite you and host you in a free Iran. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for tuning in.